That Christmas Eve, I returned home with a small gift from my father. A sonogram of my first child, the baby who would carry the Thompson bloodline. I thought he would smile, but instead he looked at me and said, "That child doesn't deserve to bear the Thompson name." I placed the gift on the table, staring straight into his eyes. "Then you'll never meet your grandchild." That night, as snow fell thickly outside the gate, I left the mansion, taking my wife, my child, and a vow never to return. Hello, my name is Mason Thompson, the eldest son of the prestigious Thompson family in Savannah, Georgia. I'm 32 years old, living in an old mansion draped in ivy-covered walls and heavy iron gates, where every corner of the house seems to whisper of history and duty. People say my family is old money, wealthy for generations, with investments stretching across the American South, from sprawling cotton fields to skyscrapers in Atlanta. But to me, that wealth feels like a gilded cage, beautiful yet suffocating, where every step I take is watched. I grew up in the shadow of my father, Bernard Thompson, the founder of Thompson and Company, a private financial conglomerate specializing in wealth management, real estate investments, and funding traditional family businesses. My father, 62, is a cold man with eyes sharp as knives and a deep, resonant voice that sounds like a command. He always wears impeccably tailored suits, his salt and pepper hair meticulously groomed, and every word he speaks carries the weight of authority. To him, reputation and status are the sole measures of a person's worth. I can still vividly recall the phrase he often repeated, his tone as firm as nails. Choosing the right person to marry is more important than choosing the right industry to invest in. Those words weren't just advice. They were a command, an invisible chain binding me to his expectations. I graduated with a degree in business administration from an Ivy League school, a path my father had charted for me since I was a child. Now I'm the director of business development at Thompson and Company, a position everyone considers prestigious, but which to me feels like a velvet-upholstered chair lined with thorns. Every day I sit in my office overlooking the Savannah River, watching ships drift lazily and ancient oaks cast their shade, trying to maintain a composed exterior. But inside I feel an emptiness, as if I'm living a life that doesn't belong to me. From the outside, our home is a picture of perfection, but inside, cracks have silently spread. My mother, Catherine, 58, is a kind but frail woman. She was once a painter, her canvases bursting with color and emotion, but my father made her set aside her passion to become the perfect wife, polished, proper, and always silent in the face of his decisions. I remember the nights of my childhood when she would sneak up to the attic to paint, her eyes sparkling like those of a young girl. But now, that spark has faded, replaced by resignation. Every time I look at her, a sharp pain pierces my chest, as if I'm witnessing a part of her soul imprisoned. Then there's Jacob, my younger brother, 29, a storm that never stops tearing through our family. Jacob is the embodiment of rebellion and recklessness. He's lazy, caught up in gambling, drinking, and fleeting relationships. Countless times I've had to drive out in the middle of the night to drag him out of a casino or a chaotic party. Each time he'd just smirk, his eyes bloodshot from liquor, and say, "Big brother, why are you always so serious?" I don't get angry at him. I just feel pity. But every time I clean up his messes, I feel the fragile thread connecting me to my family grow even thinner. The only person in this house who truly understands me is Hazel, my youngest sister, 26. Hazel is a psychologist at the Savannah Community Center, where she spends her days listening to heartbreaking stories and healing wounded souls. She's calm, insightful, with warm brown eyes that seem to see through every secret. Hazel is the only one I can confide in without fear of judgment. One rare evening, as we sat on the porch, she said to me, "Mason, you don't have to live to please Dad. You have the right to choose your own path." Her words were like a cool breeze blowing through my soul, but I didn't yet have the courage to grasp them. That day was a sweltering summer afternoon in Savannah, the air thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms and the salty tang of the river. I sat in my office facing a stack of documents about a new investment project my father had assigned me, evaluating a farm on the outskirts of Georgia to determine if it was worth Thompson and Company's capital. My father walked in, his black suit pristine, not a wrinkle in sight. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm like a reminder. "Mason," he said, his voice low and sharp, "don't disappoint me. This project isn't just about money. It's about the Thompson family's reputation." I nodded, as I always did, but inside I felt a tidal wave stirring. That night I prepared for the trip to the farm, carrying my father's expectations and the weight of unspoken pressures. Little did I know that the journey would change everything, not just the path I was on, but who I was. That morning, the Georgia sky was crystal clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the branches of ancient oaks, casting dappled patterns of light and shadow on the red dirt road leading to the farm. I drove my sleek black SUV, the one thing in my life that seemed to belong to the glamorous world of the Thompsons. The project dossier sat neatly on the passenger seat, but my mind wandered, replaying my father's words from the day before. "Don't disappoint me, Mason." His voice echoed in my head, cold and sharp, like a blade slicing into my self-respect. The farm was located on the outskirts, about an hour's drive from Savannah. When I arrived, the scent of damp earth and fresh grass flooded through the car window, mingling with the breeze rustling through endless fields of corn. The farm wasn't large, but it was tidy and well kept, with meticulously tended plots, lush rows of fruit trees, and a modest processing area tucked at the edge. I stepped out of the car, straightened my tie, and tried to maintain the professional demeanor of a business development director. But deep down, I felt out of place, as if I didn't belong here, or anywhere. Then I saw her, Rebecca Allen. She stood in the middle of the processing area, wearing a simple cotton shirt and faded jeans, holding a clipboard, her gaze focused. Her dark curly hair was tied up high, with a few loose strands falling across her forehead, and her brown skin shimmered in the sunlight as if bathed in a warm glow. She was directing a group of seasonal workers, her voice clear, sincere, but firm. "Be careful with this batch of apples. Keep them separate. Don't mix them with yesterday's," she said, and everyone nodded, working with evident respect. I stood there, forgetting why I had come. There was something about Rebecca that held my gaze. Perhaps it was her eyes, blazing with determination, as if the world could collapse but she'd still stand tall. Or maybe it was the way she moved, graceful yet confident, as if she belonged to this land, to the meticulous, patient work she was doing. I realized she was entirely different from the world I knew. The cold boardrooms, the expensive suits, the calculated conversations. I approached and introduced myself as Mason from Thompson and Company, here to evaluate the farm. Rebecca looked up, offering a slight, unpretentious smile. "Hi, I'm Rebecca Allen, the manager of the processing area here. What would you like to see first?" Her voice was warm but devoid of the flattery I was accustomed to in business dealings. I fumbled, a rare occurrence for someone like me, and simply nodded, letting her lead the way. Throughout the morning, Rebecca took me around the farm, from the cornfields to the storage barns. She explained everything with enthusiasm and expertise, from how they rotated crops to preserve the soil to how they organized seasonal labor to maximize output. I listened, but my mind wasn't entirely on the numbers or investment plans. I was captivated by the way she spoke, the way she laughed, the way she touched a ripe apple on a tree and told me it was the pride of the whole team. For the first time in my life, I felt a strange sense of peace, as if all the pressures of the outside world melted away. In the days that followed, I found every excuse to return to the farm. Sometimes it was to check additional data, other times to meet with the farm's owner to discuss details. But the truth was, I just wanted to see Rebecca. We started talking more, not just about work, but about the little things. She told me about her childhood in Alabama, about mornings running barefoot through fields, about learning farm management from her father. I told her about Savannah, but I avoided mentioning my family, my father, or the expectations weighing on my shoulders. Our relationship grew quietly like a blade of grass pushing through a crack in stone. I began to look forward to afternoons at the farm, where Rebecca and I would sit on an old wooden bench sipping coffee and talking until the sun set. She didn't care about money or status, something I'd never encountered in my world. To her, a person's worth lay in their work, their self-respect, and how they treated others. For the first time, I felt seen as a person, not as a symbol of the Thompson legacy. But that happiness didn't last long. One evening, when I returned to the mansion, my father was waiting for me in his study. The desk lamp cast light on his face, highlighting its cold, sharp features. "Mason," he said, his voice so low it made me shiver, "do you think I don't know? That girl, Rebecca Allen, a hired worker, a black woman from a middle-class background. Do you think I'd let you tarnish the Thompson family's reputation?" My heart stopped. I didn't know how much he'd uncovered, but his gaze burned through me. "Dad, I love her," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "Times have changed. Love isn't bound by race or status." He laughed, a dry, emotionless sound. "Times? You think times can change your duty to this family? I've poured my life into you, Mason. You're the heir, the future of Thompson and Company. And you dare betray me for a girl who's unworthy?" The argument erupted like a storm, sweeping everything away. I'd never dared to confront my father before, but that night I couldn't stay silent. "I'm not your tool," I said, my voice breaking with emotion. "I've spent my whole life trying to please you, to uphold the reputation you worship. But I'm tired. I want to live for myself." My father stared at me, his eyes filled with rage and disappointment. "If you choose that path, you're no longer my son," he said, each word like a knife. "Leave, and you'll have nothing." I stood there, my breathing heavy, my heart pounding. In that moment, everything inside me seemed to collapse. I realized that if I stayed, I'd forever be a dutiful shadow within the walls of honor my father had built. I said nothing more, only turned and walked out of that suffocating room. I saw my mother standing at the staircase, her trembling hands gripping the railing, her eyes fixed on my father's study. "Mason," she called softly, her voice choked. I looked up, hoping she'd say something, but she only lowered her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. Downstairs, Jacob sat at the dining table, casually cutting into an unfinished steak. "Good luck, big brother," he said, his tone flat, a mocking smirk curling his lips. Hazel, my little sister, sat quietly in the corner, her eyes heavy with sadness, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. I paused at the front door, and from behind my father's voice rang out low and cold. "You'll end up as nothing. You'll come crawling back, begging for my forgiveness." I didn't respond. I just pushed open the heavy wooden door, the cold wind rushing in, carrying with it the lingering scent of expensive cologne. As the iron gate closed behind me, its clang echoed into the Savannah night, like a full stop to the life I'd once tried to preserve. I drove away, the streetlights flashing across the windshield. In my mind, my father's voice still echoed, but this time I wasn't afraid. I felt lighter, as if the burden I'd carried for years had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The Savannah night sky was pitch black, with only a few stars peeking through thick clouds. I drove through familiar streets, the glow of streetlights casting fleeting, hazy streaks across the windshield. In my mind, my father's voice still echoed, icy and sharp. "You'll have nothing left." But this time I wasn't afraid. I felt lighter, as if a boulder that had pressed on my chest for years had been lifted. I called Rebecca, and her voice on the other end was warm like summer sunlight. "I'm at the farm," she said. "Come here, Mason." And I drove straight there without hesitation. When I arrived, Rebecca was standing on the porch, wrapped in an old sweater, her eyes gleaming under the dim light. She didn't ask much, just wrapped her arms around me, her embrace warm and steady. I told her everything. The argument with my father, how I left the house I once thought was my entire world. She listened without judgment, nodding gently and holding my hand tighter. For the first time, I felt I belonged somewhere, not because of reputation or expectations, but because of love. A week later, Rebecca and I moved into a small apartment in Midtown on the western outskirts of Savannah. The apartment was old, with peeling walls and creaky wooden floors, but to me, it was warmer than any room in the Thompson mansion. Using my experience from Thompson and Company, I applied for a job at a small investment firm specializing in financial consulting for family businesses and local farms. Thanks to my professional background, I was easily hired as a financial analyst. The job wasn't glamorous and the pay wasn't high, but I felt free. Every evening I returned to the apartment where Rebecca greeted me with a smile and a simple meal. Her laughter filled the tiny kitchen like a melody that melted away all my fatigue. 3 months later, we got married. It was a simple ceremony under the ancient oaks at Rebecca's farm. Her family and friends came, bringing homemade dishes and lively stories. Rebecca wore a plain white dress, her curly hair cascading down, beautiful like a muse. I stood there, holding her hand, my heart overflowing. But that joy was tinged with a hint of sorrow. From my side, only Hazel attended. She had snuck out of the house, defying my father's orders. "You deserve to be happy, Mason," she whispered as she hugged me, and I had to hold back tears. My mother didn't come. My father didn't come. Jacob, of course, didn't either. But when I looked at Rebecca, I knew I had made the right choice. Not long after, Rebecca got pregnant. One morning, she held up a pregnancy test, her eyes shimmering with tears. "We're going to have a baby, Mason," she said, her voice trembling with joy. I hugged her, feeling as if the entire world was contained in that embrace. Rebecca wanted us to share the news with my family, hoping our first child might soften my father's heart. I hesitated, but seeing the hope in her eyes, I nodded. "We'll try," I said, though deep down I knew it was a risky gamble. On Christmas Eve, snow fell heavily, blanketing the roads leading back to Savannah. I held Rebecca's hand as we climbed the steps of the Thompson house, my heart pounding as if it might burst. Her hand was cold in mine, but she still smiled, her eyes glowing with hope. "It'll be okay, Mason," she whispered, squeezing my hand. I nodded, though a wave of unease churned within me. The heavy oak door swung open and the lively chatter inside fell silent. My father stood at the threshold, his gaze as cold as ice, as if our presence was an insult. My mother stood behind him in a deep green silk dress, her hands clasped tightly, forcing a strained smile. Jacob, seated at the dining table, raised a glass of wine, smirking at me like I was a stranger. Only Hazel, my little sister, showed a flicker of light in her eyes when she saw me, though she quickly lowered her head as if afraid to disrupt the fragile atmosphere. We stepped inside, the air in the dining room heavy like a brewing storm. The table was lavishly set, white silk tablecloth, flickering silver candlesticks, and plates of fragrant food my mother had spent all day preparing. But no one touched it. I guided Rebecca to a seat, feeling the weight of everyone's stares like daggers. My father sat at the head of the table, his hands clenched, his gaunt fingers veined with tension. My mother sat across from him, her gaze distant, as if searching for something to hold on to. Jacob, as usual, was nonchalant, leaning back in his chair, twirling his wine glass. Hazel sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes flickering between me and my father as if trying to read both our thoughts. I took a deep breath, my hand finding Rebecca's under the table. Her skin was warm, but I could feel her pulse racing. "Dad, Mom," I began, my voice slightly trembling but steadying as I spoke. "We have good news. Rebecca is pregnant. The baby will carry the Thompson bloodline." I paused, hoping even faintly that my words might thaw the ice in the room. I looked at my father, waiting for a spark in his eyes, a sign of acceptance. But he only stared at me, his gaze like twin blades cutting deep into my heart. He leaned forward, his lips pressed tight, and spoke slowly, his voice sharp as a knife. "That child doesn't deserve to bear the Thompson name." Each word was a slash. "You've already removed yourself from this family, Mason. Did you think I'd accept her?" He pointed at Rebecca, his voice heavy with contempt. The air froze. Rebecca squeezed my hand, her body tensing, but she held her head high, her gaze resolute. "Sir," she said, her voice calm but trembling, "I don't need your acceptance to love Mason or to love our child." Her words were like a small flame burning brightly in the cold room, but my father only scoffed, a dry, emotionless sound. My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her trembling hands covering her mouth as she tried to stifle a sob. "Bernard, enough," she said, her voice breaking. But my father only shook his head, his eyes never leaving me. She turned and hurried toward the staircase, her figure disappearing into the dark hallway. I heard the bedroom door slam shut, a sound that echoed like a declaration of her helplessness. Jacob at the corner of the table raised his wine glass, a mocking smirk on his lips. "Congratulations, big brother," he said, his tone flippant as if the whole world was a joke. "A new family, how touching." I looked at him, my heart aching, but I didn't respond. Jacob would never understand, and perhaps he didn't want to. Hazel bowed her head, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles whitened. I saw her eyes, pained, helpless, but full of empathy. She wanted to say something, I knew, but she chose silence, as she always did in moments when our family fractured. I wanted to call her name, to ask her to stand with me, but I knew she too was trapped in this house, just as I once was. My heart shattered, but I refused to let my father see my weakness. I stood, pulling a small box from my coat pocket, the Christmas gift Rebecca and I had carefully prepared. A framed sonogram wrapped in red paper with "For Dad" written in black ink. I placed it on the table in front of him, my eyes locked on his. "This is your grandchild," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "The child you'll never meet." My father glanced at the box, his eyes flickering briefly, but then he turned away as if it meant nothing. Rebecca stood, taking my hand, her gaze still strong despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "Let's go, Mason," she whispered, her voice soft but certain. I nodded, leading her out of the room past the flickering candles that now only made me feel colder. Outside, the snow fell thickly, dusting our shoulders like a cold blanket. I heard the screech of the iron gate as it closed behind us, a sharp sound like a final verdict. Christmas, a time meant for reunion, had become the day I was erased from the Thompson family. I held Rebecca's hand tightly, feeling her warmth against the biting wind. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice choked. She shook her head, hugged me, and said, "You don't need to apologize. We have each other, and we have our child. That's all I need." I looked at her, her eyes shining through the snowy veil, and I knew that even if I'd lost everything, I still had her, and our unborn child, the ones who would be my true family. We walked away, leaving the Thompson house behind, and I vowed to myself that no matter how hard the future might be, I would never let them endure the pain of this night. The days following that Christmas Eve were turbulent, like a boat tossed in stormy seas. I returned to my job at the small investment firm in Midtown, trying to maintain a normal rhythm, but one morning my boss called me into his office. "Mason," he said, avoiding my gaze, "we have to downsize." "I'm sorry." His explanation was vague, unconvincing, and when I pressed for more, he just shook his head, muttering something about pressure from above. I knew immediately. My father's influence had reached here. Bernard Thompson never let anyone challenge him without paying a price. I stood outside the office, clutching the termination letter, feeling the ground crumble beneath me. But when I returned to our apartment, Rebecca was waiting, her eyes still shining with resolve. "We'll be okay, Mason," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "But I think maybe we should leave Savannah. Here, your father won't leave us alone." Her words cut like a knife, but I knew she was right. My father's power, with his vast financial connections and influence, could crush us at any moment. We decided to leave, heading to rural Alabama, where Rebecca was born. I packed a few belongings, things worth little compared to the lavish life I'd once known. Rebecca smiled, carefully wrapping her old ceramic bowls and a few family photos. "We're starting over, Mason," she said, her voice soft but certain. "And this time, it'll be our own life." The village in Alabama was small, nestled among golden cornfields where the wind carried the scent of damp earth and the distant crow of roosters. Simple wooden houses dotted the landscape, their tile roofs faded under the sun. To me, everything was unfamiliar. No skyscrapers, no opulent boardrooms, no incessant ringing of phones. But that very unfamiliarity brought relief. I was no longer the Thompson heir, no longer my father's shadow. I found work as a farmhand at a nearby farm. The job was grueling, hauling crates of produce, fixing fences under the scorching sun. Sweat soaked my shirt, my hands grew calloused, but I felt at ease. No more complex financial reports, no more scrutinizing stares. Each evening I returned to our small wooden house where Rebecca greeted me with a smile and the aroma of bean soup. Our meals were simple: bread, soup, a plate of vegetables. But I realized true happiness wasn't found in lavish feasts, but in moments like these. Sitting beside Rebecca, listening to her talk about her day, my heart brimming with contentment. Rebecca opened a small tailoring shop at the corner of the village market. She sat at an old sewing machine, her eyes focused, her deft hands transforming rough fabric into dresses and shirts. The work was demanding, but she persevered, and soon her shop became a gathering place for villagers who came to order clothes and chat lively. "That Miss Allen is so capable," they said, and I felt proud watching Rebecca earn their respect. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Allen, lived a few houses down and occasionally stopped by, bringing tomatoes or cucumbers from their garden. "Keep an eye on that Mason boy, don't let him work himself too hard," Mr. Allen teased, and I laughed, feeling like I'd found a new family. Spring arrived, bringing gentle rains and vibrant green fields. One morning, Rebecca went into labor. I drove her to the county hospital, holding her hand the entire way, my heart pounding with both worry and excitement. When our son's first cry echoed through the room, I knelt beside her bed, tears streaming down my face. Little Luke, with curly hair like his mother's and bright, sparkling eyes, was the most precious gift I'd ever received. I looked at Rebecca, exhausted but radiant, and hugged her tightly. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice choked. "Thank you for giving me everything." Luke's birth brought overwhelming joy. Rebecca's family came, bearing blessings and small gifts: a hand-knitted blanket, a tiny pair of woolen shoes. Mr. and Mrs. Allen held their grandson, beaming with pride. And I realized this was the true meaning of family: a place of unconditional love, free of calculations or expectations. On summer evenings, I sat on the porch listening to the crickets hum, watching Rebecca rock Luke to sleep in an old wooden cradle. She sang softly, an Alabama folk song, her voice sweet as a breeze. I leaned against the doorframe, feeling a peace I'd never known in my life. This life was simple, but in that simplicity I found what I'd always lacked: a place to belong. A year passed, and our life in Alabama slowly found its rhythm. Little Luke, with his curly hair and bright eyes like his mother's, began to take wobbly steps across the wooden floor. His laughter, clear as a bell, lit up the house. Rebecca stayed busy with her tailoring shop, her hands deftly working the old sewing machine, while I labored at the farm, sweat soaking my shirt but my heart light. In the afternoons, I'd come home to find Luke playing on the grass, Rebecca watching him with love in her eyes. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and for me that was enough. But that peace, I slowly realized, was only a fragile pause before the storm. One morning I received a message from the farm owner. "Mason, I'm sorry," he said, his voice hesitant over the phone. "I can't keep you on. There are some issues." He didn't elaborate, but I knew. My father, Bernard Thompson, had reached even this quiet corner of rural Alabama. I stood in the middle of the cornfield, gripping the phone, feeling an invisible hand strangling me. My father, with his unyielding pride, couldn't bear that I was living happily without him. I returned home trying to hide my worry, but Rebecca saw through me. She always did. "What's wrong, Mason?" she asked, resting her hand on mine. I told her about the firing, about my suspicion that my father was behind it. Her eyes darkened, but she didn't let me see her fear. "We'll find a way," she said, her voice firm. But even Rebecca couldn't have foreseen how much worse things would get. A few weeks later, Rebecca's tailoring shop began to lose customers. The women who once chatted lively in her shop now avoided it, citing vague excuses about being busy. One day, Mrs. Harris, a loyal customer, pulled Rebecca aside at the market and whispered, "Miss Allen, I don't want you to get in trouble, but some people from Savannah came around, asking about you and Mason. They weren't friendly." Rebecca relayed this to me, her voice trembling slightly, and I felt my blood boil. My father wasn't just trying to ruin my life. He was dragging Rebecca into his wrath. I couldn't take it anymore. That night, after Luke was asleep, I called my father. The phone rang for a long time before his voice came through, cold as ice. "Mason," he said, as if my name itself was a disappointment. "Are you calling to apologize?" "What are you doing?" I asked, struggling to keep from shouting. "Why won't you leave us alone?" He laughed, a dry, emotionless sound. "You think you can walk away from your family's responsibilities and live like some nobody? I gave you everything, Mason. Reputation, wealth, a future. And you threw it away for a girl who's unworthy. Come back, take over Thompson and Company, and I'll stop." "Don't you get it?" I replied, my voice choked with anger and pain. "I don't want to live in your cage anymore. I've found happiness, a real family. You can't take that away." "You'll regret this," he said, then hung up. The beeping tone sounded like a warning, and I knew he wouldn't stop. My father, with his vast financial connections and power, would keep tightening the noose around us. The months that followed became a series of escapes. We moved constantly from Alabama to nearby small towns, hoping to find a place beyond my father's reach. But each time his shadow loomed. I was fired again with vague excuses. No one dared hire me, as if the name Mason Thompson had been marked. Rebecca's tailoring shop couldn't survive either. Customers vanished and she began to wear out. I saw her sitting by the window, her gaze pensive, her hands resting on her stomach where Luke once grew. "I just want our son to grow up in peace," she whispered, and my heart broke. I had pulled her into this storm, and now I was powerless to protect her. In the days that followed, we moved again, this time to an even smaller town a few hours' drive from Alabama. Our new home was a modest wooden apartment, its tin roof clattering under the rain, but it was warm enough to shelter our little family. I found work at an auto repair shop, a manual job with low pay, but I hoped it was far enough to escape my father's reach. Rebecca tried to reopen her tailoring shop, but the spark in her eyes had dimmed. Worry had etched itself onto her face, though she tried to hide it with forced smiles. Each night as Luke slept soundly, I held her in the darkness, whispering promises that everything would be okay. But even I wasn't sure I believed it. One chilly early winter afternoon, as the wind swept through barren fields, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated, my heart pounding, fearing it was another debt collector or bad news from Savannah. Rebecca, playing with Luke on the rug, looked up, her eyes filled with concern. I opened the door, and there stood my mother, Catherine Thompson. Her face was gaunt, her silver hair falling loosely across her forehead, but her eyes held a determination I'd never seen before. She stood there, clutching an old suitcase, her thin coat trembling in the cold wind. "Mason," she said, her voice choked but resolute, "I came to see you." I was stunned, at a loss for words. Rebecca stood, holding Luke in her arms, and invited her in. We sat around our small wooden table, the golden glow of a hanging lamp illuminating my mother's face, highlighting wrinkles I hadn't noticed before. She spoke slowly, her voice heavy with emotion, explaining that she'd overheard my father talking to a stranger, a private investigator he'd hired to track us. She learned he'd been using his money and influence to pressure employers, forcing them to fire me and driving customers away from Rebecca's shop. "I couldn't stand it anymore," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "I've spent my whole life in silence, letting your father control everything. but I can't let him destroy your life any longer." She revealed that she'd left Savannah, bringing with her a secret stash of savings she'd kept hidden from my father for years. Money he didn't know existed. "I want to use it to help you, Mason," she said, her voice trembling. "And I'm sorry. Sorry for not protecting you when you needed me most." Her apology was like a knife, both painful and soothing. I remembered the nights of my childhood when she'd read me stories, her voice warm like a lullaby. For years I'd thought that voice was gone, buried under the facade of the perfect wife. But now it was back, faint but sincere. I said nothing, only stood and hugged her. Her frail arms held me, and in that embrace I felt the love I'd thought was lost beneath her polished exterior. Rebecca, standing nearby, smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "Stay with us," she said, and my mother nodded, a rare smile breaking across her lips. My mother moved in with us. She looked after Luke, playing with him and telling him the same stories she once told me. One day I saw her pull out a box of paints and old canvases from her suitcase. "I used to paint," she said hesitantly, as if afraid I'd judge her. But when I saw her begin to sketch, her trembling hands tracing the first lines, I knew she was rediscovering herself. Her paintings, rural landscapes, cornfields under the sun, and Luke's smile seemed to breathe life into our home. Rebecca reopened her tailoring shop in a quieter corner of the town's market. She worked tirelessly, and slowly the locals returned, bringing fabric and stories. My job at the repair shop, though far from glamorous, was steady, and for the first time in months, I didn't have to look over my shoulder to see if someone was watching. Each evening we gathered around our simple dining table, a plate of mashed potatoes, vegetables from the Allen's garden, and Luke's laughter as my mother teased him with a silly story. The scent of wood smoke from the fireplace mingled with the soft glow of the lamp, and I felt a peace I'd once thought impossible. Since my mother's arrival, the pressure from my father seemed to fade. No more unexpected termination letters, no more whispers about people from Savannah. Rebecca's shop began to thrive again, with customers returning in droves. We lived steadily for 6 months, the longest stretch of calm we'd had since leaving Savannah. I started to believe that my mother's departure had changed my father, that he'd realized the cost of his pride. 6 months passed, and our life in the small town settled into a familiar rhythm. I worked at the auto repair shop, my hands calloused from tightening bolts and fixing machinery. But each day I felt stronger, not from physical strength, but because I was living the life I'd chosen. Rebecca, with her radiant smile, was busy at her tailoring shop, and Luke, our little boy, grew more spirited, running around the yard with his clear, joyful laughter. My mother painted more, her artwork adorning our walls, adding splashes of color to our simple happiness. I thought perhaps we had truly escaped my father's shadow. But one early autumn night, as I was lulling Luke to sleep, the phone rang, cutting through my soft singing. Luke stirred, his small eyes tightly shut, and I quickly answered to avoid waking him. It was Hazel, her voice trembling, unlike the calm little sister I'd always known. "Mason," she said, as if struggling to hold back her emotions. "Things here are falling apart." I sat down on the old wooden chair, my heart pounding. Hazel explained that since my mother left, our father had grown silent, almost unrecognizable. He locked himself in his study, speaking to no one, drinking and staring out the window. Thompson and Company, the financial empire he'd built with such pride, was crumbling. Dozens of contracts were left unfinished, branches lacked oversight, and employees had lost faith. His age and health could no longer turn the tide. But the worst, Hazel said, was Jacob. My younger brother, with his characteristic recklessness, had abused the new position our father gave him, embezzling company funds. He spent lavishly on parties, friends, and fleeting pleasures. When the scandal broke, the press descended like vultures, tearing into Thompson and Company mercilessly. Stocks plummeted, partners turned their backs, and the Thompson name, once a symbol of power, was now smeared across headlines. "Dad knows everything," Hazel said, her voice breaking. He understands that his blind pride has pushed everything to the brink, but he doesn't know what to do. I sat frozen, gripping the phone tightly. Hazel continued, her voice growing softer. She said he sat in his study staring at the sonogram I'd left behind that Christmas Eve. The picture of Luke, the grandchild he'd once declared unworthy of the Thompson name. Hazel said that many nights she heard him call my name in his delirious sleep, his voice hollow, like a man who had lost everything. The call ended and I sat in the darkness listening to the patter of rain on the porch. Rebecca came in, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Hazel?" she asked. I nodded, recounting everything. She listened, her eyes pensive, then asked, "What are you thinking, Mason?" I didn't answer right away, only stared out the window where raindrops glimmered under the streetlights. A storm of emotions churned within me. Anger, pain, and a flicker of pity. My father had done everything to destroy my life, but now he was paying the price with the very empire he'd built. A few days later, I came across a local newspaper. Its front page featuring a photo of my father leaning on a cane as he left the Thompson and Company building. His face was gaunt, his eyes vacant, devoid of the commanding presence he once had. The headline read, "Thompson and Company on the brink of bankruptcy." I stared at the photo, my heart heavy. Part of me wanted to fold the paper and forget it, but another part, one I didn't want to acknowledge, felt a pang of sorrow. I folded the paper without a word, but the image haunted me. One evening, the phone rang again. This time, Hazel's voice was more urgent. "Mason, Dad's in the hospital. He's very weak," she said. "He wants to see you. Can you come back?" My hand trembled as I held the phone. Outside, the cold early-season wind swept through the dry cornfields. I looked at Rebecca rocking Luke to sleep and my mother sketching a painting under the lamplight. I knew it was time to return to Savannah. I stood up, trying to keep my breathing steady, but my heart pounded as if it might burst. Rebecca looked up, her eyes reading every thought in my mind. "You have to go," she said, not as a question but as an understanding. I nodded, hugging her and Luke tightly, then kissing my mother's forehead. "I'll be back soon," I whispered, though I wasn't certain if that was true. I packed a few clothes into an old canvas bag and borrowed a pickup truck from our neighbor, Mr. Harris. The engine sputtered to life with a screech, the smell of old motor oil filling the air. But it was all I needed to make the journey back to Savannah. The night road was pitch black, illuminated only by the weak glow of the headlights stretching across the endless highway. Cold wind slipped through the window's cracks, carrying the crisp edge of autumn. I drove through the night, my mind in turmoil. Images of my father surfaced, not the powerful man in a perfect suit, but the gaunt old man from the newspaper photo leaning on a cane, his eyes hollow. I thought of our confrontations, of that Christmas Eve when he disowned me, of the sonogram he'd scorned. But above all, I thought of my childhood days when he'd carried me on his shoulders, pointing out ships on the Savannah River and sharing his dreams of building an empire. Was that father still there, or had his pride consumed him? When I arrived at the Savannah hospital, dawn was just breaking. Pale morning light filtered through the glass windows, making the hospital air feel even colder. Hazel was sitting by my father's bedside, her eyes red and her face weary, but she managed a faint smile when she saw me. "You came," she whispered, standing to hug me. She held my hand for a moment as if passing me strength, then quietly left, leaving me and my father alone in the room with only the steady beep of the heart monitor breaking the silence. My father lay there, frail, his hair almost entirely white, his skin wrinkled like thin paper. He looked smaller than I remembered, as if time and illness had stripped away all his commanding presence. As I approached, he stirred awake, his eyes flickering with surprise, then sinking with pain and regret. We were no longer two men locked in anger, just a father and son separated by the vast distance of years. I pulled a chair to his bedside and sat, resting my hand on his. His skin was cold and dry, a reminder of his fragility. Silence hung heavily, so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. Then he spoke, his voice weak, almost a whisper. "Mason, I'm sorry." Those simple leaden words stunned me. "I was wrong," he continued, his voice breaking. "I let pride blind me. I only wanted you to preserve the family legacy, but I lost you." Tears rolled down his weathered face, tears I'd never seen before. I bowed my head, emotions surging. Anger, pain, and a trace of pity. I wanted to say I forgave him, but my throat tightened, as if years of hurt still blocked the way. Instead, I squeezed his hand tighter and said, "Focus on getting better, Dad. I'll come back. I'll help the company recover." We sat there talking for the first time in years without arguing. He spoke of the early days of building Thompson and Company, of the dreams he'd once had and the fear of losing it all. I told him about Luke, about his smile, about how he called me Daddy in his babbling voice. My father smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and I saw his eyes light up, as if brought back to life through stories of his grandson. Eventually, he drifted into sleep, his breathing steadier. I adjusted his blanket, watching him rest, his face more peaceful than I'd ever seen. The heart monitor beeped steadily behind, like the rhythm of a new beginning. I stood and walked out to the hallway where Hazel was waiting. She hugged me without a word, but I knew she shared my hope that the door between my father and me hadn't closed entirely. The next day, I called Rebecca. Her voice came through the phone, gentle but brimming with strength. "Are you okay, Mason?" she asked. I told her about my father, his apologies, and my promise to return and save Thompson and Company. She was silent for a moment, then said, "If that's what you need to do, I'm with you. We'll do it together." Her words were like a cool breeze sweeping away my doubts. I knew it was time to bring our little family back to Savannah, not to return to the gilded cage, but to build a new future grounded in love and forgiveness. A few days later, I brought Rebecca, Luke, and my mother back to the Thompson mansion where I was born and raised. As the iron gate swung open, a flood of memories rushed in, childhood days running through the garden, evenings when my mother read me stories, and the confrontations with my father. But this time, the atmosphere in the house was different. Gone was the cold tension. Rebecca brought her laughter. Luke scampered through the halls, calling Grandma in his babbling voice. And my mother, with a gentle smile, began hanging her paintings on the walls. The house, once fractured by pride and misunderstandings, slowly grew warm again, as if infused with the spirit of my family. I officially took over as CEO of Thompson and Company. On my first day in the office, I felt the weight of the employees' scrutinizing gazes. They stood and greeted me, but I saw doubt in their eyes. Could the rebellious son save a crumbling empire? I didn't say much, only shook each person's hand, looked them in the eye, and began reorganizing. The books were chaotic, contracts were unfinished, and partners' trust was nearly gone. But I wasn't afraid. I had survived the hardest days in Alabama, and I knew that with patience and determination I could do this. One late afternoon, Jacob appeared. He stood at the office door, his face haggard, his suit wrinkled, stripped of the defiant arrogance he once wore. "Big brother," he said, his voice hoarse, I have nowhere else to go." My heart ached at the sight of my younger brother, but I didn't let emotion sway me. "Jacob," I said calmly, "stay and help me rebuild the company. But this time, there's no room for mistakes." He looked at me, his eyes filled with anger and hurt, then turned and walked away. I stood frozen, watching his figure disappear, my heart heavy but resolute. I couldn't let Jacob drag our family down again. The next day, I took action. I cut off all financial support to Jacob, froze his credit cards, and held a press conference. Before the reporters, I declared, Jacob Thompson is no longer a member of the Thompson family. His actions and mistakes are unrelated to Thompson and Company. He will bear full responsibility for himself. The words were heavy but necessary. I didn't want to hurt my parents, but I knew that without setting boundaries, Jacob would continue to destroy everything. I ran the company with a new approach, firm but fair, decisive but not authoritarian. I met with each partner, persuading them to return, correcting past mistakes. Within 2 years, Thompson and Company began to recover. Stocks rose again, branches stabilized, and the Thompson name echoed once more in financial circles, not as a stain, but as a symbol of rebirth. My father's health also improved. He began to stand and walk lightly, even playing with Luke in the garden. Watching him carry his grandson, laughing as Luke tugged at his hair, filled me with bittersweet joy. He was no longer the commanding Bernard Thompson, but simply a grandfather finding solace in simple moments. My mother, with her increasingly vibrant paintings, seemed to rediscover herself. Rebecca learned to play the guitar, and every evening her folk melodies filled the house with laughter. Hazel, my sister, read stories to Luke, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. And my father and I, we sat at the table discussing the company's future, no longer as adversaries, but as two men working toward a shared goal. On autumn evenings, as the breeze gently rustled the oaks in the garden, the Thompson house felt alive with a new spirit. But things weren't entirely perfect. Jacob remained missing, with no word of his whereabouts. My parents sometimes sat in silence, their eyes heavy with sadness when his name came up. "Will Jacob find his way back?" my mother asked once, her voice trembling. I took her hand, comforting her. "He'll realize his mistakes, Mom. We just have to wait." Years passed, and under my leadership, Thompson and Company not only regained its standing but soared beyond its golden era. The name Thompson and Company once again became a symbol of resilience and innovation. Each day as I stepped into the office, I no longer felt the weight of being an heir, but the pride of a man building his own legacy. One early spring morning, my father called me into his old study. He sat there, not in his usual impeccable suit, but in a simple sweater, his white hair falling loosely across his forehead. "Mason," he said, his voice slow but steady, "I've decided to retire. From now on, Thompson and Company is yours." I looked at him, saying nothing, only nodding. But when he stood and hugged me, awkwardly but warmly, I felt a connection we'd never had before. He was no longer the commanding Bernard Thompson, but simply a father who wanted to spend his remaining years with his family. He began to live more slowly. I often saw him and my mother strolling through the park, hand in hand like newlyweds. He read books, played chess, and sometimes looked after Luke, patiently telling him stories about the ships on the Savannah River. Watching him, I realized that time and love could heal even the deepest wounds. Then one day, Rebecca called me from her tailoring shop, her voice trembling with joy. "Mason, I have good news," she said. "We're having another child, a girl." I stood frozen, nearly dropping the phone. When I rushed home and hugged her tightly, tears streamed down my cheeks. Luke, playing with his wooden blocks, looked up curiously and asked, "Daddy, why are you crying?" I laughed, pulling him into my arms, and said, "Because I'm happy, son." The news was like a new ray of light, filling our family with emotion. When my father heard, he insisted on throwing a grand party at the Thompson mansion, inviting friends, partners, and loved ones. "We need to celebrate," he said, his eyes shining as they once did. That night, the mansion glowed under candlelight, with soft piano music filling the air. The long dining table was elegantly decorated, wine shimmering in glasses and candlelight reflecting off crystal. Guests gathered, their laughter and chatter lively, but I only wanted to stand beside Rebecca, holding her hand, feeling the warmth of the woman who had changed my life. My mother, in an elegant green dress, stood by my father, her smile radiant as if she'd rediscovered herself. Hazel, ever calm, played with Luke, reading him fairy tales. The atmosphere brimmed with joy, yet I still felt a small void. Jacob, my brother, whom I still hoped would return. Midway through the party, my father stood, a glass of wine in hand, his gaze sweeping the room. Everyone fell silent, waiting. His voice was slow but resolute. "I've spent my life chasing reputation and pride, and I paid a heavy price. I lost years of love to my own blindness." He paused, looking at my mother, then at me and Rebecca. "I'm sorry. To Catherine, to Mason, to Rebecca. For my mistakes. And today, before all of you, I want to say that Rebecca and my grandchildren, Luke and the child yet to come, are part of the Thompson family. Not by title, but by love and pride. Applause erupted. Rebecca squeezed my hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. I held her tightly, my heart swelling with happiness. My mother looked at my father, her eyes filled with emotion, as if she'd waited a lifetime for those words. Hazel smiled, her eyes glistening, knowing that at last our wounds had healed. Then at that moment, the grand doors of the banquet hall swung open. The music stopped, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. Jacob stood there, thinner, his eyes sunken, his face a mix of guilt and remorse. He wore an old coat, his hair disheveled, but his eyes, though weary, still held a trace of the brother I once knew. The room fell silent. No one spoke, no one cast blame. I felt the gazes of my father, my mother, and myself, all filled with compassion. Jacob lowered his head, tears rolling down his cheeks, and I stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're home?" I said, my voice choked. He didn't respond, only hugged me, and the room seemed to exhale as one. The party continued, bathed in warm light. No one dwelled on the past, for we all understood. Family didn't need to be perfect, only willing to return. That night, as fireworks burst across the Savannah sky, I stood on the porch, Rebecca leaning against my shoulder, Luke asleep in my mother's arms, and my father by my side, his gaze fixed on the sparkling lights. I looked at my family, knowing that the circle of love, though once broken, had finally been made whole. My journey was far from easy. I walked away from a life anyone would envy, expensive suits, opulent boardrooms, and the renowned Thompson name. But I also abandoned that gilded cage to find myself. I faced my father's rejection, months of running, and moments when hope seemed lost. Yet in my darkest days I found light. In Rebecca's smile, in Luke's first cry, in my mother's embrace, and ultimately in my father's apology. Every step, every wound taught me that true happiness lies not in others' expectations, but in what your heart yearns for. Rebecca once told me on an afternoon in Alabama, as we sat on the porch watching Luke play in the grass, "Happiness is daring to live authentically, Mason. No matter how hard it gets, as long as you don't give up, everything will be okay." Those words became my guiding star. I learned that love, whether romantic, familial, or self-love, requires courage. Courage to face prejudice, to forgive, and to rise after falling. Jacob was proof of that. When he stood at the banquet hall door, gaunt and filled with remorse, I didn't see a failure, but a brother who had lost his way and finally found his way back. I don't know what he endured during his years away, but his eyes that night spoke of lessons learned. And my father, the man who once placed pride above all, learned to bow his head, apologize, and love unconditionally. Watching him play with Luke or hold my mother's hand in the park, I realized it's never too late to change. If I could offer advice to anyone feeling lost, caught between others' expectations and their own desires, I'd say, listen to your heart. Life isn't a contract that needs to be perfect. It's a painting, sometimes messy, but always worth creating. Don't fear mistakes, for they will lead you to where you belong. And if you lose your way, remember that family, whether by blood or by choice, is always waiting for your return. That night, as the fireworks faded into the sky, I held Rebecca's hand, feeling her warmth and knowing our unborn daughter would grow up in a home filled with love. I looked at my father, my mother, Hazel, and Jacob, then up at the Savannah sky, where stars twinkled as if reminding me that every struggle, every pain was worth this moment. My life, once shattered, had been stitched back together with threads of love, forgiveness, and hope. And if I could do it, anyone can.